Good afternoon. Good afternoon. I'm going to talk today. I'm not a historian. I am just an ethicist, and that's why I'm so glad that I was able to participate in this wonderful panel to engage this very timely and important topic, because this is definitely one of the most pressing moral and ethical issues that we are currently facing. I am somewhat going to pick up on some points Mr. Brick was touching on about how do we use the civil rights movement in the useful past, right? Or should we be using the civil rights movement as a useful past? And so thus the title of this talk, I guess you will, would be The Fight for Marriage Equality. Not racial, but still a civil right. Not racial, but still a civil right. And if I would give this a provocative title to wake everybody up, since I'm going last, I think I'm thinking about it like this. Gay ain't the new black, but both are queer niggas. Gay ain't the new black, but both are queer niggas. The civil rights movement is a staple of the American political imagination. After 244 years of slavery and an additional century of racial apartheid, courageous African Americans, along with their progressive allies, forced this nation to honor civil protections afforded in theory but denied in practice to her darker sons and daughters. Also known as the Black Freedom Struggle, this historical movement, narrowly defined by the 1950s and 60s, has become a standard point of reference for mass protests in recent decades. It has become a definitive marker of admiration and emulation, as appeals to this particular civil rights movement are everywhere. Former President George W. Bush pitched his No Child Left Behind education bill as the new front on the war on civil rights, fighting, I quote, the soft bigotry of low expectations. The religious right sees no irony in appealing to Martin Luther King Jr. and Thurgood Marshall to defend their right of the unborn, even as many of its leaders continue to protest civil rights protections of women and men of color, not to mention LGBTQ communities. And in valiantly fighting for the rights of the imprisoned and those victimized by the vestiges of racial injustice or class discrimination. Famed former civil rights icons, often and somewhat anachronistically, reference Emmett Till and the Edmund Pettus Bridge as their media talking points, regardless of how inconsistent such images may be with contemporary realities. It comes with little surprise then that some members and friends of the LGBT community have hitched their conceptual wagons to the Black freedom struggle of the previous century. Just as African Americans fought for equal protections and rights under the law, many LGBTQ persons resist being relegated to second-class citizenship inside the closets of heteronormativity. In the process, some have even suggested that the fight over same-sex marriage is an extension of the Black freedom movement for racial equality. This creates a problem. Rather than fostering an alliance based upon a shared conception of exclusion, many African Americans are agitated by the analogy. For many African Americans, the term civil rights has a distinctive connotation. And folks rightly argue that same-sex marriage was neither the aim nor necessary conclusion of this Black freedom struggle and the civil rights movement. In short, gay ain't the new black. Personally, I tend to agree with this latter point, but for different reasons than many from my own racial community. For me, the assumption that minority status comes with quote-unquote who you are rather than what you do creates a false and flawed division. The argument that being LGBTQ is a choice, unlike racial phenotype, that's just a poor argument. Science has substantiated a biological basis for homosexuality and a range of sexual choices, sexual attractions. And an estimated 4,000 children are born each year with what doctors refer to as ambiguous genitalia. Moreover, I find the thought of millions of men and women choosing self-imposed social exile to be preposterous. The innumerable teenagers that have tragically taken their own lives due to the burden of same-sex attraction undercuts this whole quote-unquote choice rationale. On the other hand, I do believe that injustice is historically contextual and specific. And while modes of social injustice are indeed interrelated, i.e., the relationship between racism, classism, or the cultural connection between sexism and homophobia, they are still distinguishable and historical contingent when we're talking about such isms as racism, sexism, heterosexism, classism, ageism, etc. For instance, we know that white women can fight against male hierarchy, even as they ignore their own complicity in racial stratification. We know that middle-class African Americans can challenge racial discrimination in the workplace, while simultaneously reinforcing detrimental conceptions of the black poor. A social ethicist Emily Town told one group attending a conference at Claremont School of Theology recently, oppression is peculiar. And to reinforce this point, just even as we were walking in the door here, as we were standing at the door, together preparing for this, a woman walked up to me in the midst of all of us and said, "I assume you work here. Can you point me to the bathroom?" So it's with this point that Emily Towns was making that I agree. Quite frankly, there's just a disconnect. There's too much of a disconnect for me between African Americans' long fight for slavery and segregation solely determined on the color of one's skin and the contemporary fight for same-sex marriages. For example, we know white members of the LGBT community have in many ways benefited from racial and class privilege. Gay men owned slaves, lesbian women promoted systems of racial segregation, and transgendered and queer communities continue to be highly stratified and exclusionist on the basis of race and class, rendering many LGBTQ brothers and sisters invisible. We should not forget it was this nation's Federal Bureau of Investigation, led by a gay white man, J.A. Hoover, which sought to squelch the civil rights activity and efforts of openly gay and lesbian activists like Bayard Rustin and Earth Thunder. Not to mention the several other prominent civil rights leaders of the 1960s who continue to live discreet, though not necessarily denied, gay lives. Thus, the particularity of white supremacy and legalized racial discrimination in previous epochs resists hackneyed comparisons to the black freedom struggle by those advocating other issues, regardless of how right these issues may be. At the same time, we have to acknowledge, particularly the African American community, that civil rights transcends racial communities. Black folks hardly have a monopoly on constitutional protections. Civil rights are, in theory, afforded to all citizens. The will of the majority can never impinge upon the lives of the minority. Everyone is entitled to equal rights and protections of the law, regardless of race, ethnicity, religion, gender, physical handicap, or sexual orientation. This is why petitions for civil rights should not be interpreted as claims for exceptional privileges for any particular group, but rather equal protection under the law. Julian Barnes